Now we will be starting the concurrent session 1, Global Stocktake. I would like to introduce the moderators for the session. Professor David Sandalow. Professor David Sandalow is ICEF Steering Committee, inaugural Fellow of Center of Global Energy Policy, Columbia University, Co-Director of Energy and Environment Concentration, School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. So I would like to ask Professor Sandalow to moderate this session. Professor Sandalow, if you please.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here at ICEF. It's been another tremendous day of dialogue about clean energy and innovation. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, especially the people who are behind the scenes. A conference this good doesn't happen without a lot of hard work from a lot of people. So big thanks particularly to the METI staff, to the NATO staff, and to our chair, Nobuo Tanaka. Thank you very much. And today we're going to talk about the global stocktake in this session. And I'll just start by saying that the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a remarkable achievement. It brought together 180 nations, more than 180 nations, with very different economies, cultures, and interests around a goal of fighting climate change. That's not an easy thing to do. And the mechanism that was used to do that was to have every nation sign up to nationally determined contributions, national climate action plans that each country would determine on its own, and then submit to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But now the drafters of the Paris Agreement realized that in combination, these nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, were not going to be sufficient to solve the problem. And so they built into the Paris Agreement a mechanism for taking stock. Every 5 years, the nations of the world would get together, look at whether the NDCs were doing enough, and then if they weren't, figuring out what needs to come next. Well, that first process, the global stocktake process, has been underway for the past couple of years, and is going to culminate in a couple of months at COP28 in Dubai. And that's what we're here to discuss in this session. And we couldn't have a better combination of panelists to talk about it. I'm really thrilled at who we have here and the dialogue that's about to come. And let me introduce them, and then we'll have presentations by each of them, and then some conversation and questions from all of you. And joining us remotely is Heather Maseko-Msyale. Thank you so much for joining us. Heather is at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Intergovernmental Support and Collective Progress Office, and is key to the whole global stocktake process. She's working on this within the UNFCCC, supporting the negotiations around the global stocktake and related issues. Before joining the UNFCCC, she worked at UNDP, UN Development Program, coordinating climate and resilience programs with the Peace Corps, Civil Society Network, and many other important positions. Second, we have here on stage with me Petra Minnerop, who's a professor of international law at Durham Law School, Durham University, a distinguished legal scholar with experience University of Durham, University of Dundee, and an extensive publication record. I couldn't believe it when I saw your resume, how much professor has written on this topic. And then Akibi TSUKUI, who is a program manager at Climate and Energy Unit at the Institute for Global Energy Environmental Strategies here in Tokyo. Her primary focus revolves around conducting research and activities relating to international regimes, with a particular focus on the global stocktake in Article 6. And in that capacity, she's worked with and been a member of the Japanese delegation working on these issues. So with that, I'm delighted to start by turning the floor over to Heather Maseko-Msyale to get us started on this topic. Heather, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, David, for that good introduction.
Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I think it may be kind of late where you are, so, or maybe it's early. So wherever you are, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So I will start my presentation today by outlining what the global Stocktake process is, and I'll mainly focus on the process itself, moving from the technical phase of the assessment and into the current phase that we're in now, the political phase. As I have named my presentation, is what does the global step want to achieve? So a mechanism to assess collective progress, enhance action, but also enable international cooperation for climate action. David has already explained the background to the global Stocktake as provided for in the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the global Stocktake, we can see it as what others are calling an ambition cycle. So we have the Paris goals. The Paris goals tells us where we want to be, but over time, there is a very high chance that countries or commitments that are put through via the national determined contribution or long-term strategies do not meet that. So every 5 years, we will undergo a very inclusive, party-driven, with the engagement of non-party actors to collectively assess how far we are towards those goals. And then, of course, this is hinged on the transparency framework of the UNFCCC as well, making sure that countries are coming together, they are raising their ambition, they are putting forward their commitment and doing also in a transparent manner. Next slide, please. So how has the global Stocktake being framed? What are the key pillars of the global Stocktake? So the global Stocktake started in November of 2021. I will not go through the entire process, but just to give you an overview of what has been done so far. So we collected information from various sources, particularly from science sources, the IPCC, from parties, from non-party stakeholders, and then we move that information into what we call the technical assessment. And most of you would have been engaged in the technical assessment, and the culmination of the technical assessment were 3 technical dialogues that were managed by the co-facilitators with the engagement of various members of the society. And what that led to was the final factual synthesis report. And I'll touch a little bit on that because that was the main outcome. What that is telling us is that across the 3 pillars of the global Stocktake, next slide, please. Across the 3 pillars of the global Stocktake, in mitigation, in adaptation, and in means of implementation, there's considerable progress that has been done towards climate action, but there are also huge gaps to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, both the long-term temperature goals, for instance, making finance flows consistent with the Paris Agreement, and also making sure that communities and economies are resilient to the impacts of climate change. So on the screen there, you will see some of the key outcomes. They are showing us that our collective action, our collective ambition is not in line with what science is telling us in terms of climate action. There's need for transitions that are just. There's need to diversify our economies, and there's also need just to pull more ambition for countries to bring together more ambition and more action. And in adaptation, it also noted that there's a lot of action, there's a lot of ambition happening, but collectively these need support to be delivered, these need financing to be delivered. But also recognizing that because of climate change, ecosystems, communities are quite stretched, and this is leading to losses and damage from the impacts of climate change, and the importance of local context, locally led transformations as well. And in terms of means of implementation, I've also touched on this because this also enables us to deliver those ambitions, to deliver those actions. And the synthesis report or the technical assessment tells us that there's need to deploy more cleaner technologies, there's need for more capacity building, and most importantly, there's need to upscale financing for climate change, financing for adaptation, for mitigation, and in this it categorizes all forms of financing. Next. So as I talked about the global Stocktake, the technical assessment provided us with the synthesis of information, with the evidence, and also the information in terms of where we are and how far we have gone and where we need to be. Now we are in the consideration of outputs phase, which started soon after the subsidiary bodies meeting in June. And basically, this is a myriad of several events and several activities managed by what we call the high-level committee to make sure that countries are already garnering internally that are looking inwardly to see how will they raise ambition. There are several activities, and the UNFCCC and the convention itself invited stakeholders to engage as much as possible to say, how do we then use these outcomes from the technical assessment? Just to highlight a few key examples, for instance, are the regional weeks, where there's regional messages, where there's regional perspectives on what the outcome should look like. And of course, we had the SG ambition, the UN Secretary General's Ambition Summit, and soon we will have a workshop to put together what the global stock outcome would look like. For instance, if we have a decision, how does this decision provide the much needed guidance to countries and to parties? And then, of course, there are the high-level events as well. These feed into the whole GST process by making sure that countries are already committing to higher ambitions. They're already reflecting on how they will operationalize the global Stocktake. Next slide, please. And just to pull out some of the key elements in the consideration of output phase in terms of what are the key critical things that we should be looking at for this phase of the global Stocktake. So firstly, it will make sure that the elements are agreed on by all countries and we have the support of non-party stakeholders. For instance, a global Stocktake outcome that provides guidance. Now, should it provide targets? Should it feed into what policy priorities should be? And then also making sure that it has an intrinsic capability to inform and update and strengthen ambition and actions, particularly through the NDCs, as David had alluded to earlier. And also the importance of synergies with other key global priorities, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals, transition towards cleaner technologies, cleaner energy, and also how we incorporate science, how we make the process inclusive, how we make sure that these processes are equitable, and how we make sure that the outcomes of the global Stocktake are realized. And the final slide, please. Just to allude to this, and I know that other members of the panel will talk to this, and they talked about the enhanced transparency framework. So the importance of the global Stocktake is the process itself, but also the end game. So making sure that there's raised ambition, there's raised action. So the screen there or the slide there just shows you what parties have already agreed on in terms of the biannual transparency reports, updating of NDCs in 2024, adaptation communications, and just making sure that the global stake has that ability to inform all those processes. Thank you very much. I think what I've just tried to do in this couple of minutes is to provide you with an overview of the global Stocktake and some of the key elements that will be critical from now till COP28 as we look forward to an ambitious and strong GST outcome. Thank you, and over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Heather. You're getting applause in the room. I don't know if you can hear it, but you're getting applause in the room. Thank you very much for that great overview of this diplomatic process. And as I understand it from your comments, there's going to be a decision at COP28, and that will help, the idea is that will help shape the nationally determined contributions that countries will provide in the next round in 2024 and 2025. I had one specific, just maybe this is a minor item, a follow-up, but could you say a word about that transparency report next year? And how does that fit into this whole process? That is that a report from the UNFCCC or by somebody else?
So the biannual transparency reports are facilitated by the Secretariat. And basically, this could be a first level, for instance, for parties in consideration in indicating how they're raising ambition. So the entire transparency framework is hinged on the notion that parties need to put forward in a transparent manner what they are doing in terms of action, the support that they'll be providing, and then also how that is going to raise their ambition. So this is facilitated through the Secretariat, yes, and soon after the global Stocktake, it is the next level where we can see some sort of response to the GST, to the global Stocktake outcomes, but mainly according to the guidance in the Paris Agreement and in Katowice, what parties agreed on is that the main outcomes would feed into the strategies and the plans. So mainly the NDCs are what we're looking forward to.
Thank you very much. So this is an experiment in some ways, I think in every way, that we have a global problem that the world community has decided to come together to fight, and every nation is doing its part, and we have a process that provides transparency on what they're doing and that urges them to do more and more and more. And one, I think, very important part of this is the legal nature of this, and Professor Minnerop is an expert in the legal nature of these commitments. And could you please elaborate about your view about the legal nature of these commitments for the global stocktake?
Thank you very much, Chair, for this very kind introduction. Distinguished members of the steering committee, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me today to talk about the global stocktake at this very prestigious conference at its 10th anniversary. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Now, this morning and this day has been really informative. We've learned about policy making, we've learned about innovation, knowledge transfer, and we've even talked about the need for thorough analysis and prescription. And I think this is where the law has a role to play, because there is no change without a law. We need clear legal targets. Now, in my presentation today, there will be no cuts, but hopefully you can see the lion in it. I will try my very best, although I've just been allocated 5 minutes, so it will be quite challenging to make these legal arguments, and I hope we can maybe elaborate some of the facets in the question and answer session afterwards. Now, one further comment I would like to make maybe at the outset is that the law can enable innovation. It can trace the science, it can be part of an interdisciplinary discourse, and when that happens, it can bring about far more effective and suitable means and targets, but the law is also very fragile, and that is especially true for international law. When international law is violated, we often see that human suffering will occur. So I think in this room and audience at home as well, we have a role to play in ensuring that the law is observed and strengthened. And I would like to introduce you to an innovative legal argument about the role of the NDCs and the global stocktake as an interplay. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. So we've heard that the global stocktake will lead to an outcome, a decision. It's not entirely sure, but it will lead to an outcome at COP28, which will then bring the first global stocktake to a close after 2 years of deliberation and consultation and consideration of the issues involved. I will give you a very brief overview, given that we've just had one over the mandate in the process of the global stocktake. Some procedural rules on the information and that parties need to submit with their indices, the so-called Information on Clarity, Transparency and Understanding, or ICTU. And then I would like to come to the final point, to the line in the argument, where I would argue that NDCs are unilateral acts in international law, and they are qualified through the global stocktake. Now, this is text of the Paris Agreement. As a lawyer, I'm almost bound to give you some text of the Paris Agreement here. Now, on mitigation, it is required that parties will take the outcomes of the stocktake into account in a post-global stocktake world to raise ambition. This was the whole idea that this mechanism that is treaty-based conveys. It requires, of course, the design of the global stocktake to be robust, to be timely, and to somehow be aligned and twinned with this 5-yearly cycle of new NDC submissions. Now, given that we have had so many reports already to indicate and very lately the synthesis report of IPCC AR6 again, to indicate that we are not on track to achieving 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius limitation towards the end of this century. How can this global stocktake make a difference? So the question I'm concerned with is how can we ensure that this becomes a legal lever and not just a political commitment? Now, there were these 3 phases. We've just heard about these 3 phases of the global stocktake, starting at COP26 with the information collection, the technical assessment that was split into 3 technical dialogues that happened at the subsidiary body conferences in Bonn. And now the final consideration of outputs will conclude at COP28. Now, there's also a decision of parties on what will happen with this consideration of output. And the idea is that these outcomes of the global stocktake will inform parties in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner their actions and support, as well as in enhancing international cooperation for climate action. So this is not policy prescriptive. It is meant to be the function of a guidance. Now, throughout these 3 technical dialogues, there were 3 elements that were considered: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And the meeting of the parties under the Paris Agreement has decided that the outcomes then that are agreed in COP28 will summarize opportunities and challenges for enhancing action and support in the light of equity and the best available science, as well as lessons learned and good practices. Now, you can see that for a lawyer, this could be language that is still rather vague and ambiguous. Now, some interesting elements of these technical dialogues are, of course, that non-party stakeholders, and we will hear more about this in a few moments, were invited to provide their input. And for example, in Durham University, I've led the initiative to make a submission, a written submission to the Global Stocktake, but also to present a poster at the SB conference. Now, how then can this all fold into a legal argument? Now, the argument is based on the fact that nationally determined contributions, albeit their content is nationally determined, are unilateral acts under international law. Unilateral acts under international law can be made through a formal declaration, a verbal declaration, but the most critical point is that based on a unilateral act, there can be concrete legal obligations. It's very similar to a treaty obligation that arises under a multilateral treaty. And only because maybe some of the NDCs are not phrased as setting forth clear legal targets, that does not mean that not the form of action, the NDC, cannot be per se legally relevant. This is similar to a treaty that sets forth vague and wide and interpretative rules and provisions. It is still a treaty and binding on parties. Equally the case for NDCs as a form of action. And this is so because parties have had the intention to make these NDCs their binding contribution to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Without these NDCs, the Paris Agreement cannot function. They become integral parts of the treaty. They are prescribed by the treaty. As we know, there is an obligation to submit and maintain an NDC. This is not a voluntary act. It is mandatory. Now, if then there is a treaty-based mechanism by which we may find out that we are not on track to achieving the goals of these treaties, how can we bring this together? Now, I think if the treaty makes a promise, that is the NDC, the unilateral act, of achieving a certain outcome with this NDC. But if then the treaty-based mechanism finds out this outcome cannot be achieved based on the NDC, then there's also a legal obligation to improve the ambition in the NDCs. Each and every single party must then scrutinize their ambition with a view to ensuring that the next NDC follows immediately after the global stocktake and will be more ambitious so that the global goal can be achieved. So by qualifying NDCs as unilateral acts, we can translate the collective goal into more ambitious unilateral action. There is then an additional duty of due diligence for parties to provide also the information as to how the outcome of the global stocktake has informed them in preparing their next NDCs. So in addition to the global stocktake, there is another due diligence obligation. And these then turn NDCs in prescribed, qualified, unilateral acts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll come back to talk about these ideas. But you mentioned the importance of non-state actors in this process, and that's what Ms. TSUKUI is an expert in. So could you please tell us about the role of non-state actors in the global stocktake and what's happening here in Japan in particular?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, distinguished delegates and participants, steering committee members. And it is my pleasure to make presentation at this ICEF 2023. So today I'd like to talk about the non-state actors' contribution to the global stocktake process. So as we have already heard, the first global stocktake had started in COP26 in 2026. And throughout the 2022 and the first half of 2023, there was a technical assessment where 3 technical dialogues were convened. And in September, there was a synthesis report on technical dialogues, which was issued by the Secretariat. So at COP28 this December, the countries negotiate the outcomes of the global stocktake. And as it's been explained that the parties need to enhance their nationally determined contributions, as well as enhance international cooperation based on the outcomes of the GST. And throughout the GST process, the importance of the non-state actors' engagement has been recognized. So these, when I refer to non-state actors, it includes all actors apart from government, national government, such as civil society, private sectors, financial institutions, local governments, academia, and NGOs. And here are my observations how non-state actors contributed to the GST process. The non-state actors provided input to the GST process. According to the summary reports of the technical dialogue, there were 278 submissions made to the technical dialogues, with 186 by non-state actors and 29 by national governments. So you can see how GST process empowered non-state actors to participate in the international negotiation, climate change negotiation process. And non-party stakeholders also participated in the technical dialogues and engaged and discussed with the technical experts from the government. And their voices expressed at the technical dialogues have been incorporated in the summary reports and synthesis report. And some of the ideas and thoughts shared by the non-state actors, such as the importance of phasing fossil fuels or importance of marine emissions, were explicitly included in the report. So this is one example of how non-state actors consortium working together to ensure the robust GST. This consortium is called Independent Global Stocktake, aims to empower countries' governments to take greater climate ambition by conducting research on mitigation, adaptation, equity, and finance, as well as sharing on the ground experiences in African countries, Southeast Asia, and Latin American countries to complement existing information. And this independent global stocktake has also collaborated with stakeholders and groups that are often marginalized, such as ones from developing countries or indigenous peoples group, youth, and gender, like women. So as I explained, the synthesis report on the technical dialogue has been published in this September. And the synthesis report includes some specific messages to non-state actors. The synthesis report recognized that the non-state actors increasingly support governments in implementing the Paris Agreement and in enabling governments to implement national plans by aligning their activities with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The synthesis report also recognized that the government needs to support the systems transformations to respond to the climate change. And in this context, credible, accountable, and transparent actions by non-state actors are needed. So what I would like to emphasize here is the outcomes of the GST is not just the negotiation text. It could serve as a guideline and roadmap for both non-state actors in the government in implementing their climate actions after GST, after conclusion of the first GST. So as it's been also explained that it is clearly mentioned in the Paris Agreement, the parties need to update their NDCs as well as enhance international cooperation. However, there is no clear guidance on how non-state actors actually can keep engaging with the GST process after the conclusion of the GST. So these are some of my ideas how non-state actors can engage and contribute to the post-GST process. Non-state actors can directly engage with the government, such as participating in the national panels, or providing information, such as concrete evidence or research to policymakers. And last but not least, non-state actors can also implement their climate actions and initiatives by incorporating the outcomes of the GST. So how we can, so there are potentials and possibilities of non-state actors can keep engaging with the GST process, but the question is how can we unlock these opportunities? So I think two steps are needed, and first is the GST needs to send clear messages on the non-state actors, and then the second step is parties need to respond to these messages. So I would expect that the GST outcomes at COP28 include some messages on non-state actors. It can explicitly acknowledge the valuable contribution of non-state actors in climate action, and it can convey a strong message to governments about the importance of strengthening cooperation with non-state actors. And the outcomes of the GST also clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the non-state actors to update the next round of the NDC. And how can government implement these messages? And I think there are many ways to realize these messages, but these are some ideas. And first, the government can define the roles of non-state actors in the policymaking process, as well as establish in-country mechanisms for incorporating GST outcomes into NDC updates involving non-state actors. And third, not only focusing on the country, but also international cooperation and regional cooperation is crucial. So government can use new or existing international and regional platforms to facilitate dialogue with non-state actors. So when we look at the situation in Japan, Japan has already established the public engagement system when developing and updating policies, but to more effectively incorporate inputs from non-state actors, this public engagement system could be enhanced and could be strengthened. And the second point is that Japan has promoted climate action through multiple ways, and some of the cases are like bilateral and multilateral cooperation, particularly in Asian region. And I think ICEF is also a good opportunity for governments, officials, and non-state actors to have a dialogue together. So we could also utilize these opportunities to create space for non-state actors to engage with the government stakeholders so that they can also find opportunities to implement their actions in multiple ways. So that's all from my side, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our expert speakers. In a moment, I want to ask you about COP28 and what you think success looks like for the global stocktake at COP28. But before we do that, I just want to offer a comment. I think the global stocktake is all about diplomatic process, and it's extremely important diplomatic process to get the world moving forward. But in my opinion, the evidence is overwhelming that the world is failing to address this problem. I just read this morning a news article, some of you may have seen, that September 2023 was the warmest September ever recorded, that the record for global average temperatures in September may have been, this is I think tentative, 0.8 degrees higher global average than the previous September, which is so just an extraordinary breaking of the record of previous September temperatures. The temperature in September in many places in the Northern Hemisphere was more like historic temperatures during July. And July 6, 2023 was the warmest day ever recorded in terms of global average temperatures. July 2023 was the warmest month ever recorded, and the warmest 9 years have been the past 9 years. In my city in New York for several days in July had the dirtiest air in the world by far. At one point, PM 2.5 levels in New York reached 850, all because of wildfires 1,000 kilometers away, caused by drying out of the forests in Canada. We've seen extraordinary flooding this summer in Beijing and other places in Pakistan, a third of the country underwater, and just around the world, terrible impacts of global warming. I don't think there's any doubt that at a kind of top level in terms of talking to the public, we are failing to address this problem. So how do we move the world forward with innovative diplomatic processes? And ICEF is all about innovation. So with that, let me just turn to the panelists and any thoughts you might have about, from your view, in your view, what would success look like at COP28 when it comes to the global stocktake, if you have any thoughts on that. And I'll start with you, Heather.
Thank you, David. So again, I think you have explained it quite rightly that COP, the global stocktake, these are all diplomatic processes. But I think what we would see as a very strong and ambitious outcome is one that will help countries move together, help the globe move together to accelerate our efforts towards the Paris Agreement. Because it is clear that we know where we want to be. So the global stocktake is more, how then do we get there? So the ability of an outcome that provides guidance, ability of an outcome that provides those policy signals, and an outcome that gives us the sense of direction in terms of what parties, what non-party stakeholders should be collectively doing would be a strong and ambitious outcome. And of course, we taking the global stake as an opportunity to course correct in this critical decade. As you have said, we've got evidence, the science is there, the results from the technical assessment are there, pointing us in the direction that we would want to take. So the ability of a COP outcome to include those into bringing consensus at a global level on what should be done to enhance resilience and adaptation, to make sure that we reach the long-term temperature goal within 1.5 degrees and also just making sure that we have enough supports and means of implementation. And then also, secondly, is I think when we look at from a political standpoint, I think the COP28 is an opportunity to get that political momentum from different countries, from non-state actors as well, in terms of commitments towards what they would enhance in terms of ambition and outcome. And I think the last speaker had clearly indicated the role of non-party stakeholders or non-state actors in this process. And COP28 could also be a lever to make sure that the global stocktake after process is inclusive. You have youth, you have women, you have indigenous communities, businesses, private sectors, all making commitments towards how they'll enhance their action and ambition. Thank you, and I'll hand over to the other panelists.
Thank you. Petra, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is the absolutely important question. What will this global stocktake bring at COP28? And I think we have to remember that this is a treaty-based mechanism to which parties have agreed, knowing that they may need to review their NDCs. And it's very important that this is done in very clear terms, because the first global stocktake may well also serve as a template for future global stocktakes. It's only the first time. There will be another one in 5 years' time. So it's very important to ensure that parties adhere to what they have agreed in 2015. And my second point would be that hopefully we will see a clear COP and CMA decision with clear terminology that binds in the outcomes of the technical assessment phase of the global stocktake, because these decisions are very important for the interpretation of the treaty regime. They can develop, they can expand treaty provisions, including Article 4, including Article 14. So this could then lead to more clarity, and I'm not speaking about political guidance, but about legal clarity in terms of how these provisions are to be interpreted. So hopefully we will see clear language and mandatory language coming out of the COP and CMA decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Akibi.
Thank you very much for the important question. And the first thing I'd like to emphasize is that, as you mentioned, the window of opportunity is closing. So if we miss this opportunity, we have to wait for the next 5 years, and we can't take climate actions. So the COP28 GST outcomes is really critical. And from the non-state actors' perspective, the CMA decision, global stocktake decision, needs to be actionable and implementable, so that the non-state actors can incorporate the decisions into their actions and enhance their actions. And more specifically, it also covers like sectors, so that the people on the sector can also take action based on the outcomes of the GST. So my point is, like, the GST outcomes needs to be actionable so that the people can take action.
Well, thank you. I want to see if there's any questions from the audience. Please raise your hands, and I know we have microphones. And while we see if there are any questions, I want to turn to you, Professor Minnerop, because I have a concern about your argument, and I wanted to see what you think about it. If I understand your position, your view is that countries can put whatever they want into their nationally determined contributions, as long as it raises ambition a little bit from the previous one. You can correct me if I'm not stating your position right, but they could put whatever they want in. But then once they put something in, they're legally bound by it. And I'm concerned that if a country's legally bound by what it's putting in its nationally determined contribution, that could weaken ambition. I know that, for example, in the United States, our government often sets very ambitious goals. It's not always clear how we're going to achieve them, but the fact that the goal is set creates momentum in the political process to try to achieve it. But if the government thought there might be some legal penalty for failing to achieve this ambitious goal, it might hesitate and might set a less ambitious goal. So You're nodding your head. Sounds like you've heard this before. What are your thoughts about that?
No, thank you very much. I was hoping that you would bring up this point actually to allow for proper discussion. So I think there are 2 points we have to clearly distinguish. So one is an NDC as per the form of action, a legally relevant instrument. Can it be legally binding? Because it is a certain instrument that a state has used. And the second question is then the scope of the substantive legal obligations that arise from the NDCs. And I'm not interfering with that at all, because these are nationally determined contributions. States will define the terms in how far they want to be legally bound, for example. Some states have set clear sector-wide targets, others have economy-wide, quantified emission reduction targets. Some include all gases, some not. So this is something that states design. However, it is a different question to ask, can an NDC be legally binding per the form of action? And it can. And we have seen that, in fact, under other international regimes in the environment, but also under the GATS, for example, where we've got services schedules, where states also assume through unilateral action certain duties. In the regime of the Ramsar Convention, for example, we have a very similar mechanism where upon ratification to the Ramsar Convention, a state must declare at least one wetland, and that is again a unilateral act or measure or declaration that is legally binding upon that state making this decision, and it's mandated by the treaty regime. Similar to here, the Paris Agreement in Article 4 mandating the NDCs, but then giving the freedom to states to define how ambitious they want to be. But that is then coupled with the global stocktake mechanism as a mechanism that subsequently is designed to qualify these unilateral acts. So the leeway of states is narrowed in terms of defining their ambition, because they know that previous ambition was not high enough. So in a way, this is a mechanism that explains to parties, hopefully, how to distribute the carbon budget that is shrinking.
Heather, I saw you nodding your head up and down at one point. Do you have any comments on this or any thoughts on it from your work?
I think from the Secretariat, again, we facilitate and make sure that we're providing that platform for countries to do, I think as the professor has indicated, to share those lessons and to raise those ambitions. So it's quite interesting to hear such perspectives in terms of how do you make sure that while the global Stocktake will inform countries on what they should do in their NDC, we also need to make sure that the NDCs are responsive to the outcomes of the global Stocktake. But I think what's also critical, and that's where the enhanced transparency framework feeds into and comes into, is to say that putting it forward in the NDCs as well is not the only thing, but these need to be actionable. So the results and how do we measure those, and how do we collectively look at those from now in 2024 and 5 years after that. So this is all quite an interesting web, if I can put it that way. But what the convention then tries to do is to provide that platform and to provide the synergy across the processes. So not only within the global Stocktake, but within adaptation, for instance, with mitigation, with means of implementation, and to put forward ambition. And I just wanted to mention, David, that later this week, the Secretariat will be publishing the synthesis report on the elements based on the views that parties and non-party stakeholders have put forward on what the GST outcome would be. And it's good to note that some of the issues that are being discussed in this platform will likely be reflected.
Thank you. Ms. TSUKUI, non-state actors have been important in the preparation of the global Stocktake, but do you have any thoughts about the role of non-state actors in implementing the results going forward, and how will they be involved in the years after the release of the global Stocktake in this whole process?
Thank you very much for the question. As I explained in my presentation, there are multiple ways that non-party stakeholders can implement outcomes. And as non-state actors, as well as researchers, we are currently thinking to organize the regional stocktake in Southeast Asia. One of the challenges for governments to update NDCs and enhance international cooperation based on the outcomes of the GSD is that the GSD assesses the collective progress at the global international level, while the NDCs are country level targets. So, which means government needs to translate or digest the outcomes of the GSD, localize the result into their context, and I'm sure some of the countries have capacity to do that, but others may not. So that's why, translating the international level messages to the regional level could help some countries to enhance their actions, and non-state actors can support these processes like translating the outcomes of the GSD, providing the regional information to complement the available information. Also, they can bring many non-state actors, regional non-state actors, to work with the government. So these are kind of one idea that how non-state actors can work with the government in updating the NDC.
Thank you. And again, if anyone in the audience has a question, John, we have a microphone to John Moore up in the front.
Thank you very much. So I suppose my question is is about the practicalities of the report, and just what is the structure of the report in terms of is it by country or by sector or by like how does it actually break down, and just to understand how it's usable. And my second question is it a gap to what's the benchmark that the gap is to? Is it to the NDCs and what people have? Is it saying how far are we off what people would like to be, or is it to a sort of net zero? And if it's to a net zero, which of the very many net zero curves is it a gap to? So I suppose it's what are the categories and what's the baseline that we're monitoring against?
Heather, I think those were mainly for you. Did you hear those?
Yes, I did. And just to clarify, when you're referencing to the report, do you mean the synthesis report?
Yeah, whatever the key output will be, that will be, hopefully everybody will read. And
well, and maybe it's worth clarifying, and you could, there's been a technical report, a major technical report that's already been submitted, and now the political decision remains to be made at COP28, reflecting that technical report. But Heather, maybe you could elaborate on that because you know this process very well.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so at the end of the technical assessment, following the technical dialogues, we had the factor synthesis report. So this brought together the views from parties and non-party stakeholders, and there were various sources, I have to say, for this particular result. For this particular report, I had mentioned the IPCC report as one of the sources, but we also had information from reports from other non-party stakeholders, submissions from countries, and through actual workshops that were organized over a period of 3 technical dialogues. So all this culminated into the synthesis report, and that's where I had highlighted the outcomes for mitigation, the outcomes for adaptation, and the outcomes for means of implementation. So it is collective progress, and it reflects as such as collective progress. And then coming on to now this current phase, the political phase of the global stocktake, and then outcome from COP28. I would not envision a report per se as an outcome, because we want something that's actionable, but what we're calling as a GSD outcome and providing guidance could take different forms or shapes, and parties are still discussing that. I think earlier we had talked about potentially a decision text that comes out, and then with this, it's the clear guidance, again, collective guidance that would be going out to the parties or to the non-party stakeholders as well. But I would just also want to highlight that I think as you read the synthesis report, I mean, there's various categorizations there, there's various implications, there's various underlying assumptions that have been provided that also helps a reader, party or non-party, to provide different perspectives or to put the outcomes into their own regional or into their own country perspective.
Yes, I think that's Atsui, if I see correctly, yes.
I'm Atsushi Kurosawa from the Institute of Applied Energy. So I have not question, just a comment. So maybe GST process in the three streams. One is adaptation, another is mitigation and finance. So, but all stream is not independent. So it's have interacted all together. So maybe, and also it is very hard to add the adaptation effort for every country. So it is not quantified at this point. So just clarification of the process methodology or something else. So in the future, maybe adaptation, mitigation, interaction should be considered in the GST process because of the adaptation mitigation portfolio is very important in the global sense.
Thank you. So there's a particular focus on adaptation in your comment, yes, and the importance of adaptation.
Yeah, additionality of adaptation efforts in the global sense. How do you do that?
So Heather, I don't know if you heard this, but the question is about, and comment is about adaptation and how to think about that in terms of the global stocktake. And I think it's a very interesting point because often we think a lot about mitigation, kind of the points I was making earlier about heat waves and droughts and floods, and we know that we're not doing enough to address the worst impacts. And we also hear a lot about finance, I think, and we're not meeting the $100 billion commitment from the developed countries. But how about adaptation? How do we think about that? And what does the synthesis report say about adaptation? What do you expect the parties to say about adaptation at COP28?
Thank you for that, David. And I think just to point out that the guidance for the global stocktake, the Katowice guidance, and also provided is in the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think it provides already for that balance between the discussions for adaptation, for mitigation, and means of implementation. I mean, the practice could perhaps be different, but this puts adaptation, the resilience of economies, the resilience of ecosystems, the resilience of our communities on the same footing. And from the synthesis report, I think I had indicated some of the issues that were coming up, and that's to say that there's a lot of ambition that's coming up, reflected in the national adaptation plans, reflected in practice, but there's also huge gaps. So we often hear that adaptation is often fragmented, the actions are often incremental and not transformational, and we're also seeing that these practices are started or not coherent in a way. And the synthesis report did bring out those issues, and of course the big gap in terms of support for implementation, and support in terms of finance, support in terms of technology, support in terms of capacity. So just to mention that there is specific outcomes that have been put forward in terms of adaptation, and then for COP28 we'll also look forward to more discussions in terms of what would the outcome be like. For instance, how does it even link with the global goal on adaptation that was that started, or where the discussion started in Sharm last year? How do we assess effectiveness or adequacy of adaptation? So all those questions were teased down in the synthesis report, and it will be interesting to see what sort of guidance do we give to the different parties on that as well. But this is now where the intergovernmental process comes in. I cannot preempt what that sort of discussion would look like, but the elements of the report that I referred to just earlier on would provide pointers in terms of what non-party stakeholders are saying and what parties are saying in terms of what the outcome would be on adaptation.
Okay, I appreciate the effort. So very hard challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, we are just about out of time, and let me just conclude with this comment. This is the 10th anniversary of the ICEF conference, and from the beginning, the ICEF conference has been deeply connected to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiating process. The year after the first ICEF conference was held was the Paris conference, and one of the steering committee members at the time was Ambassador Laurence Toubiana, who was one of the principal shapers of the Paris Agreement. And the focus on innovation that the ICEF conference highlighted played directly into the shaping of the Paris Agreement, I think, in some very important ways, both in innovative diplomacy and a focus on innovation in the agreement. And the ICEF conference continues to be very closely connected with the UNFCCC process, including with dialogue on important topics like this that will be central to COP28. We're really fortunate that we had such expert speakers at this panel. Thank you for joining us, and please give them a big hand.